and start this off with maybe explaining what exactly the Mythos engine is.
Okay, yeah, it's probably a good background. So, the way that traditional games are developed is you typically build the game as it stands. Essentially, take a look at the types of gameplay that you want to have in the game, and then you build something very specific for that game. So if you're talking about a game that you typically download, like a casual game off the App Store, it's really designed for one purpose, which is pretty much to just be played as the game that it is. And so when we start, we did that with Genesis as part of the collaboration with the third-party game studio. And when I came on board, I'm not a huge fan of building software that way in general. And we found that it was just very rigid and not something that would allow us to iterate and change and make tweaks, which is what Umberto sort of alluded to, is that like we're very early in the process of building Web3 games. Web3 gaming is in its infancy, and you need the ability to be agile and change things very easily and adapt. And you also need to be able to scale with very few resources. And so when we sat back and started looking at World of Kogaea and designing it, we took sort of a different approach, which is more of an enterprise software approach, where we focused very heavily on frameworks and building features in a way that they are not tightly coupled. Some of this conversation will be a little technical, but I'll try and sort of expand on it. So basically what that means is that two features within a game aren't sort of written just to work with each other. They're written in a way that they can work with other things. And so, for example, we'll cover it a little bit, but the concept of earning something in a game, getting a reward, that concept of earning something can be made into sort of a generic framework or pattern when you're building the game. And then that same pattern can be reused in a ton of different places. So, for example, when you guys played the World of Kogaea winter event, you were opening up treasure chests around the world, and that was using the reward system that's part of the Mythos engine. When you guys were defeating bosses at the end of the community for the last dungeon community preview, the raffle ticket drops and all the drops off the bosses for quest items, those are all coming from the rewards framework. And so by building the specific pieces of functionality that we wanted in the game in a way that they can be interconnected to each other, it gave us a different way and approach of building the games, which makes it super flexible, makes it easy for us to scale and change things. And over time, we started to realize that there was actually very little reason why they couldn't be used for other games and other sort of features and functionality. And so that's where early on we started talking about having our own MMO engine and what that. So one of the things that they tell you in game development, the first thing they tell you is don't build an MMO. The reason for that is it's extremely complicated. There's a lot of moving parts, and most of the average game developers don't have the technical skills in order to be able to build games like that. They don't have the ability to do things like complex networking. They don't have the ability to do sort of interconnected gameplay and all the stuff that comes along with it. So it's sort of a general thing that you don't build an MMO as your first game. Thankfully, we've brought on a very strong team that has a lot of experience in different areas of building games. And so our team has actually does actually have the experience to deliver on these types of things. So when we look at the Mythos engine, and I think, give me one second, I'm going to share just a part of the website so that we can go through it while we're on here. Let's find video. Let me know when you guys can see the. Actually, I just look at the Twitch stream. All right, maybe he won't bring it up. I'll talk through some other stuff while Gio's
It's here. It's here.
Oh, there we go. Now I can see it. My Twitch is just delayed. So the Mythos engine basically is a series of unified game frameworks that are designed to work with each other in a way that doesn't tightly couple them. So we can mix and match patterns and use them in different features and sort of build this very massive game with lots of different gameplay loops without having to build each of those gameplay loops individually. So, for example, that dungeon preview that we just had, from a development perspective, that was done, I think, in less than 30 days, like 30 to 60 days,
Yep.
which using our existing frameworks, which is absolutely obscene. There are other games in the Web3 space like Guild of Guardians. They are basically just a dungeon runner, and they have, I think they just went live, and it took them 3.5 years to build their game. So the fact that we were able to take the existing engine frameworks and put together a new gameplay feature in such a short period of time is sort of how you see the power of the way that we've been designing things. And so when we go to look at building this engine, we looked at what are the key pain points when it comes to building games. The first is patching and anything related to patching. It's a miserable experience to deal with the app stores. Every time you want to change one thing, it goes through a million different approvals, and half the time they basically deny you. And it's also just not great for the user to have to constantly be downloading new versions of the game. They've obviously made it easier in the app stores, but with a Windows client, you also have the same issue. And so the first thing we tackled was how do we build a game where we can basically change the game on the fly? You saw some of this in the last community preview where we patched in the final boss on the open world scene. That patch in required 0 code updates. As you saw, your game, you never had to install anything new. The servers didn't have to be patched. We basically just restarted them to pick up the new configuration. And we were able to basically put a whole new boss character on the map with its own spell engine features, new health, all that type of stuff without writing a single line of code. And so we did this by building something called a configuration framework. It's basically a series of documents that you don't need to be a developer to write. So it's the whole concept of a no-code MMO. You basically are using a language that allows you to define different types of things, spells, NPCs, creatures, and those documents give you the ability to do things like give them combat stats, tie them to the reward system. So when you kill them, you get things. And so this is sort of the core underlying feature of the Mythos engine. It's a way for pretty much anyone to essentially pick up the engine and add content. The second part is game assets. This goes along with the patching concept. Essentially, you need to be able to add new NPCs to the game, new creatures to the game, and every time you do that, you essentially have to do a build. And so the Mythos engine has basically a feature that allows you to upload 3D models, VFX icons, different types of game assets that are then imported into the game dynamically and patched in at loading. So when you first log into World of Kogaea, you typically see like a loading updates bar, and there'll be a loading updates for updating the configuration, and then also one for game assets. And so that's basically what it's doing at the end of it. Let me just check. I don't think there are any questions. Then some of the other features that we added is the ability to have sort of interconnected realms. So we talked a little bit of realms, but realms allow you to scale any game. So the average game, if you want to have some sort of server, there's a limited number of people you can have on that server. You need the ability to essentially scale that server out to support all of your user base. And so this is where the concept of our realm framework came in. It gives us the ability to duplicate the World of Kogaea worlds an infinite number of times to essentially support an infinite number of users. So if we had 1 million users tomorrow, it would take about 30 seconds to stand up the infrastructure and all of the game servers that are needed to do that. And players would be able to play with each other and communicate with each other and have friends across realms. And so this is a huge feature. You see this in games like Roblox and Minecraft. So what we're really talking about is we're building the Mythos engine is on par with some of the the top tier Web 2 gaming engines at the end of the day. So all of these features are our own proprietary technology we wrote. Nothing comes from anyone else. And there's just you'll see there's just basically a big list of them. I know it's pretty technical. We have things for vendors that basically allows us to have an integration with the blockchain for you to buy NFTs and things like that. We have an interest system. So this one is probably the biggest one that in terms of IP and sort of proprietary technology we built. The hardest part when building an MMO is how do you handle data synchronization. So when you have 50 people, 100 people on a given server, it's really not that big of a deal. You can pretty much send data in real time, everything that a person does. You can send it to everyone else. And the games work fine. That's why you see most games like Fortnite and other sort of MOBA type games usually cap at about 100 players. You find very rarely that there are companies that have the ability to support more than 100 players. You're looking at like World of Warcraft that can support anywhere between, I think it's like 1,000 and 1,200 players per server, all the way up to like 8,000 across a bunch of different servers. And so we basically built our own proprietary framework for what we call interest, and it basically handles data synchronization between players depending on how far they are from each other. There's a whole bunch of complex algorithms that I won't sort of go into, but that's sort of one of the key things that sort of separates us from everyone else, is that we have the ability to have large numbers of players on the map and get them all playing seamlessly. We have our entity system, which is basically a model for anything that is in game. It could be something like a mining node. It could be an NPC. It could be a creature that you battle. It could be the portals that you go in through. Basically, this is working in conjunction with the configuration framework that allows us to essentially build the world on the fly. So if you were to log into World of Kogaea's map, like Bosco Valley, for example, with the configuration system and the entity systems offline, you'd basically see an empty map. There'd be nothing there. The game is not built by the developers. The game is basically constructed in real time based on the configuration data that's passed to it. What this does is it gives us the ability to allow other people to build content. So, for example, if you wanted to have another game that had a bunch of different quests, your own NPCs, completely different set of gameplay storyline, you'd basically upload your assets, you'd upload a set of configuration files, and the engine would essentially construct the world to your liking. So I always joke that of some of the big games that are being developed, things like Other Side, which is the Yuga Labs metaverse, we could basically build their game for them. There's no reason why everything that we have in our engine is essentially a framework for building other games. And then there's other things like crafting and rewards, like I talked about. But essentially, what I'm getting at is that the Mythos engine is not World of Kogaea is actually not a game. It's basically a game built on top of an MMO engine, and that MMO engine is the Mythos engine. There's a bunch of questions I think earlier about how are you going to basically shift your focus again to be B2B versus being a gaming company. I think the thing that people don't understand is that by building our own games, we are essentially building that business. There's nothing specifically being built for the Mythos engine that isn't used in World of Kogaea as of today. That may change in the future if we want to add things in the future that are unique to other games or adding features that maybe World of Kogaea doesn't use. There have been some comments about like adding an FPS combat engine versus sort of like the target-based system that we have today. Those are all things that we'll basically look to adjust as we go and figure out what the market demands and things like that. But from a general perspective, there's no additional development going on right now in terms of PIMs and using the Mythos engine for other folks. We are essentially focused on building all of the features and functionality for World of Kogaea as our primary objective. And the benefit of doing that is we get all of those features that can then eventually be used and leveraged by other folks. So that's sort of at a high level what the Mythos engine is and why it's being why we're sort of heading down the road of being able to potentially sort of not open source it, but allow other people to leverage the technology stack as a service. And so I think there were a couple of questions about is selling the Mythos engine the base idea of Pink Moon Studios? Will it be rented out to play for people to build other games? And I think this is all sort of goes back to that sort of core concept, is that if you look at a company like Epic Games, they've got their Unreal Engine, which is a game building engine that basically people use, and then they have their own games that they've built with it. One of the hardest parts about building an engine is if you don't build the game with the engine, you literally have no idea if it works, one, or two, if you're building the right stuff, right? So at the end of the day, we're building an MMO engine. We better be able to deliver on an MMO that actually works and is playable. I think there was also a question I think Wu basically asked, how can you prove that the Mythos engine is useful and positive and works? I mean, everyone else, most of the people on here, I believe, have played one of our community previews. If the Mythos engine isn't real and doesn't work, I'm not really sure what you guys have been playing, because that's pretty much what you guys have been playing under the covers. You just don't know it that way. And the Mythos engine sort of marketing term is something that just is a newer thing. We decided to brand it. It's related to Greek words for building worlds in the universe and things like that, for those that like that type of stuff. But at the end of the day, the engine is functional. It's what you're playing on, and that's sort of a very important factor for how we approach building that side of the business. I would never want, nor do I think we could ever sort of onboard other gaming studios to use our engine if we can't prove that the engine works ourselves. So that's sort of that's really why you see that there's not sort of a mixed objective here. So it's not PIMS against walk. It literally is walk in order to do PIMS. So until we can deliver and prove that our engine is scalable, works for a very large game and player base, we're going to basically be just working on expanding PIMS, adding utility, until we can get to start expanding that player base. There are some very cool, interesting things that the engine allows us to do longer term by onboarding other games, things like shared friends lists. So I don't know if anyone's played World of Warcraft or anything like that, but Blizzard had something called BattleNet. It's basically the ability to have friends across all their games, and it's sort of an aggregation layer. The Mythos engine gives us that. So you can have friends that play across multiple games in the future. You can have potentially guilds that are across games. So you could have cross-game guilds, which I actually don't think it's ever been before, which is kind of cool. And so that's sort of at a high level what the Mythos engine is about, what it's used for, and how it operates. I don't know if any... Michelangelo, have you seen any other questions that were on there?
No, I think